following program is brought to you in part by a grant from the Friends of Channel 21, Incorporated.
I have here a listing of an income property in Chicago. It's got 12 apartments. Each apartment has 4 rooms. The building is brick. It's in good condition. The tenants, it says, are excellent. The rent, about $25,000 a year. What's the price for this brick 12-unit building? $75,000. Why is it so cheap, you might wonder? The answer, it's in the inner city core area of Chicago. I'm Dick Goldberg, and on this edition of Inside Business Today, we're going to examine the experience of being a landlord in the inner city. Do you have to be a slumlord if you are a landlord in the inner city? With me is a man who manages and owns 2,700 apartments in the core area of Chicago. Let's join him. With me is Raymond Pace. Of those 2,700 properties or apartments that you own and manage, how many of those are yours? How many of those are other folks?
67 buildings. I have partnerships in 14 of those units.
Can you tell us the nature of those properties? What are they like?
Mostly inner city, primarily minority, primarily black, primarily older buildings built around the 1920s, deteriorating housing stock.
Before you folks start thinking, here's 2 white guys talking about inner city housing, a white landlord and a white interviewer, let me just tell you. A fellow named Tom Malone was supposed to be joining us in that chair this morning. Tom Malone is a Milwaukee realtor, landlord, and property manager who is in the same capacity as Raymond Pace is in Chicago. And he was going to join us, but this show is not live. It's taped as you're watching it. And here in January, we had the coldest weather of the century this week. As a result, Tom Malone had pipes burst last night and couldn't be with us this morning. That might tell us a little about the nature of this business, but Tom Malone is a past president of the NAACP in Milwaukee. He's black, and I felt it was very important that he join us this morning, but he's not here. Does that say anything to you, Raymond, about the nature of this business, that he couldn't make it this morning for such a reason?
It's a crisis-oriented, crisis-prone business. We had the same problem. We had 13 buildings with frozen pipes, boilers down, hot water tanks at the same time. And luckily, we got through most of it the early part of this week and corrected our problems.
Does that have
next week.
Anything to do with the fact they're inner city properties?
Not so much inner city as that they're poor properties. They're older properties, were built at a time when they had coal, heat, and energy conservation wasn't considered. Many of these buildings do not have storm windows, inadequate insulation, and they're poor. They don't have the dollars to provide these items.
Who's poor? The tenants, you mean?
The buildings and the tenants. Goes hand in hand.
I'm confused. If you're running these buildings and the buildings are doing all right for you, why aren't the funds there to fix up the buildings and make them better?
Well, the buildings barely make cash flow, provide a little cash. Most of these buildings have no mortgages. The mortgages have expired, and those that do have mortgages are small mortgages. And naturally, most of the inner city buildings are unable to get current mortgages, and especially at high interest rates. So consequently, you're locked in. It's a vicious circle.
Well, you know, I know a little about real estate from my own background. And it seems to me if a property has very little cash flow, very little income to you, and you don't have a mortgage to pay on it, it must be doing terribly.
Well, it could be in some cases, but some buildings, many of our owners are owners by circumstances. They inherited the buildings. So consequently, they're stuck with the problem. They have to try and work with it. And you don't just walk away from a building, although some people do. You work with them and hope that appreciation, hope that just the hedge against inflation will finally pay off for you.
Who owns most of these buildings? What type of people? What is a profile of the person who owns? I grew up in Chicago, so I remember the 3-story walk-up brick buildings in the center city. Is it predominantly white business people that work downtown every day that own these, or what?
It was. In the 40s and 50s, there was heavy investment by white owners in minority properties, but as of the 60s, 70s, we've seen a large influx of black ownership, black capitalism buying. So I would have to say that 60 to 70% of our buildings are black owned, either by individuals or by groups, syndicates that form, families that form to buy property.
How can you manage these properties and not just get butchered in the sense of people resenting you and therefore almost wanting to vandalize the building. Here comes the white landlord who is collecting our rent, and get a lot of resentment.
I think we do get our share of a resentment, but the area that I serve, it was called the Kenwood, Oakland, Grand Boulevard area, has been predominantly black since the 1920s. It's not a fast-changing neighborhood. The community is basically stable. We know everybody. We're like a family. Our office has been in that community since 1904, so we're somewhat of a fixture. My staff is primarily black, so we haven't any problem with communication, and I was brought up in a all-black school in the black communities for my whole life, so I don't have any problem identifying the people are people. Mm-hmm. And if you treat them as such, you'll get the respect. But you'll always get X amount of people that are going to resent you because you're the landlord and you're making it and they're not, or they're poor and vice versa. And that's a part of life.
And that's not black-white, that's just landlord-tenant is what you're saying?
I think so. I've gotten very few remarks thrown at me because of the color of my skin. Only because I wouldn't do something or decorate for somebody would they get mad at me.
You know, I'm confused because I thought what you were going to say is, look, owning a black property is no different than owning a white property. A white property in a middle-class white neighborhood versus a black property in a black neighborhood that might be lower middle income or upper lower income.
Oh, there are certainly differences.
What are some of those differences?
Well, economic status for the most part. If you're talking middle-income black versus middle-income white, there's probably some degree of similarity there. But that's not the way it works.
You say some degree, or they're not identical?
They're not identical.
If you have, okay, this is a touchy area, and I do wish that Tom Malone was here to respond to these questions. But if you're, pardon?
I think Tom would agree there are subtle differences between black people and white people. But not that many when it comes to landlord-tenant relationships. The law is the law, and we have certain guidelines to go by. But most black communities in themselves are their own microcosm, and it's a different attitude, different lifestyle, somewhat different, somewhat the same, but for the most part there are distinct differences.
As a landlord?
As a landlord.
What are the differences for you if you're managing a 12-unit brick building in and the tenants are middle-class people, one white and one in a black neighborhood, both same career profiles of the tenants, same income profile of the tenants, but one building is black, one is white. What's the difference?
I have to say, very honestly, we got suburban buildings, we got inner-city buildings. I have as many and sometimes more problems from my white counterpart suburban buildings. As far as people demanding more, maybe it's their level of education, their level of income. They sometimes demand more and are more resentful. Where I think some of my black tenants are some of my best tenants. Maybe this is, I don't know if this is what you expected me to say.
Whatever your experience has been.
Some of the black tenants are the better tenants, and they're not as demanding. For whatever reason, culturally, I don't know how long we could go into that, but they expect a little less sometimes. I don't know if it's because they're used to it. That's not always true with everyone. That's a generalization, of course.
Yeah.
I have some tenants, of course, black tenants that are more demanding than my white counterparts, but they're in the minority too.
Okay, we got in a conversation when I invited you on this program, and you mentioned to me this 12-unit building. I was curious and asked you to send me this sheet that describes it. And you had told me this isn't that neighborhood that's been a stable neighborhood for a long time.
Yes.
And it's been a black neighborhood for 60 years or whatever. Right. So it's not a transitional neighborhood. And yet this property, with these physical attributes, is $75,000, and we're in a white suburb. It would be how much? $300,000
or up.
Why is it so cheap?
Well, it's an older building.
But let's say the same old building was in a suburb.
Well, then no, we wouldn't be talking $300,000. We'd be talking somewhere around $15,000 to $20,000 a unit.
So that'd be about $240,000 versus $75,000.
The economic ability to draw from the tenant as rent. When you've got a community such as this community, the top rent dollar you're going to be able to extract is only equal to the income of the occupants, the area residents.
And these 4-room apartments, what is a feasible rent in this area?
They should be around $200 to $250 right now, and they're quite low.
And if it was a suburb in the similar kind of building, in let's say where Evanston, where Northwestern is located on the northern edge of Chicago, how much might you draw from the same apartment?
You could extract anywhere from $85 to $100 per month per room, which would be the equivalent of $400.
About double the rent. And yet the price is about triple out there. Correct. So even though you get more rent, you're paying even more for the building.
That's right.
Why?
There are risks in the inner city area. Stability, the ability to gain mortgages, to get mortgages. That's difficult in inner city areas unless you have some credibility.
You say there are risks. Again, I'm hearing a couple different conflicting things.
Okay.
And I think you're being straight with me. It's just a matter of, I think it's a complicated subject. I'm hearing that having a building in an inner city stable neighborhood is no riskier than in a middle income white suburb. But on the other hand, you're telling me there's particular risks to this building that wouldn't be attached to the suburban building. What are those risks?
Well, it's just because of the geographics and economics of the community. Suburban areas are not likely to get planned unit developments. Governmental influences greatly. Down here, areas are being twisted left and right, divided up by politicians, and you're going to see those kinds of things, which keeps neighborhood, they keep them in a status quo type of non-moving situation where they're not going anywhere because there's so many pieces of the pie being divided up and being looked at. So consequently, there's no great movement in big bulks. It's always little spot movements. The suburbs have stability, strictly from the stability standpoint.
I see. So you can't hope that the neighborhood gets more solid and develops as a neighborhood and gets ritzier or whatever and then increases in value?
Oh, you can. This particular area, even though it hasn't gone through any racial changes, is going through an economic change because a half a block away they're building a $40 million hospital, which will be completed in '82. And I have sold 26 buildings there in the last year, strictly on the influence of the hospital going in.
Can you give us some examples, some figures? Let's take one building that you think was a good deal for the buyer and tell us how much they paid.
All right, a very interesting building. Do you want the best deal of the year?
Yeah, sure, give us the best deal.
48 apartments, building built in 1916. Total gross income, $142,000. These gentlemen bought the building for $25,000 cash. There were some liabilities they also assumed, though.
How big were the liabilities?
A $28,000 gas bill, $60,000 worth of unpaid real estate taxes, and $105,000 unpaid mortgage.
They assumed the mortgage?
They assumed it.
Okay, so they put $25,000 down and they assumed about $220,000 in debts.
That's right.
So they paid about $240,000 for this 48 apartment building.
Well, they went and had the tax reduction done. They worked out a deal with the county assessor. The mortgage hadn't been paid in 7 years, and someone else had bought the note. They went to this party and negotiated to buy the note for $5,000 cash. And how much was the face value of the? $155,000.
That's a bargain.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
they hadn't collected on it in 7 years, and the guy had been taking depreciation, income tax wise.
So when you get right down to it, they bought the building for about $100,000.
Correct.
With about $30,000 total in cash.
Right. This was two black brothers, both contractors, and they're going in and convert to individual heating units, which is the thing to do now. Central heat in inner city areas, it's just very difficult to maintain everyone to a proper temperature. Everyone has different needs, demands.
So your heat bill kills you as a landlord?
Yes.
Okay.
Right now, 33% of the income is expected per gas.
Okay, let's say they buy this building for $30,000 down and they go in debt $70,000. 48 apartments. How much might they put into the building to fix it up?
Depends on how they spec it out, how they figure it. Some guys figure anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 a unit,
okay,
including individual heat.
And how much rent do you think they'll get on these apartments per apartment?
They could get, if they went with a CHA subsidy, they can get maximum rent dollars up to $350 a month per unit.
So they could get about $160,000 a year in rent out of this building.
Or better.
Or better. That they'll have about $200,000 invested in, including debt and their own money. That's a phenomenal rate of return, isn't it?
It is, but not without the risks. I mean, it's not all pie in the sky. They have to work hard. They've got to relocate. They've got to do some rehab, gut-level rehab, heating plants, roofs, cosmetics. You have to make the building appealing. It has to have some